If you are a retired homeowner in the United Kingdom trying to make your pension stretch through these difficult times, I need you to stop whatever you are doing and listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, because a rule change has been pushed through so quietly that thousands of pensioners across the country have absolutely no idea what is coming for them. There were no loud announcements on the evening news. There was no letter sent to your door explaining what was happening. Your estate agent did not ring you up to warn you. Your solicitor did not send a notice. It just changed while everyone was looking the other way, and now older homeowners on fixed incomes are discovering they face enormous unexpected costs at exactly the time in life when they can least afford them. Before I go any further and explain exactly what this rule change means for you and your property, I want to ask you something important. If you find the information on this channel valuable, and you want to stay informed about what is really happening with property regulations that affect people like us, please hit that subscribe button right now. I work incredibly hard to bring you honest, straightforward information that actually matters to ordinary property owners, especially those of us in our retirement years who are already struggling with the cost of living crisis. Your subscription helps this channel grow so we can warn more pensioners and retirees before they get caught out by these changes. Now let me tell you exactly what happened while nobody was paying attention, because this affects millions of older homeowners right across the United Kingdom. The rule change I am talking about involves something called Energy Performance Certificates, which you might know as EPCs, and the minimum standards that your property must now meet. Now I know some of you might be thinking that EPC regulations have been talked about for years, so how is this suddenly urgent news? Well, here is what most people completely missed, and this is the critical part. The implementation timeline got moved up dramatically, the enforcement became much stricter, and most importantly, the way they calculate these ratings was changed in a way that has downgraded millions of properties overnight without a single brick being moved or a single improvement being made. What this means in plain English is that a property that passed with a decent rating just a few years ago might now fail under the new calculation method, and the government has confirmed that rental properties must meet a C rating by 2028, with some requirements starting as early as 2025 for new tenancies. Now, if you are thinking this only affects landlords and you just live in your own home so you are safe, I need you to keep watching because you are dangerously wrong, and I will explain exactly why in just a moment. But first let me tell you about this quiet change to the calculation method, because this is where pensioners are getting absolutely hammered. The EPC rating for your home is not just a simple measure of how much energy you use. It is a calculated score based on assumptions about your heating system, your insulation, your windows, and dozens of other factors. When the government updated the methodology, they changed how these things are scored. Heating systems that previously got good marks are now marked down. Certain types of insulation are now rated differently. Properties that scored a C or even a D under the old system are now coming back as E or F under the new calculations, and this is happening even though nothing about the actual property has changed. The house is exactly the same, but the rating is worse because they moved the goalposts. Let me tell you why this matters so much, especially for those of us living on our pensions. If you own a property that you rent out to supplement your retirement income, which thousands of pensioners do because the state pension simply does not cover the bills anymore, you are now facing a legal requirement to upgrade that property to a C rating, or you will not be allowed to rent it out. The average cost to move a property from a D rating to a C rating is currently estimated at somewhere between £8,000 and £15,000. For properties rated E or below, you are looking at £20,000 or more, and for many pensioners that money simply does not exist. You have worked your whole life, you paid off your mortgage, you thought you had a little rental property to help see you through retirement, and now you are being told you must find tens of thousands of pounds, or you lose that income entirely. The types of improvements required are not simple or cheap. The most common requirement is replacing your heating system. If you have an older gas boiler, even if it works perfectly fine, it will be marked down heavily in the EPC calculation. Upgrading to a modern condensing boiler might cost you anywhere from £2,000 to £4,000, but the government is really pushing for heat pumps, which cost between £8,000 and £15,000 depending on what type you get and what modifications your property needs. Air source heat pumps are the most common, but they require outdoor units that need space and planning permission. And they only work efficiently in well-insulated homes, which creates another problem because you might need to do the insulation first before the heat pump makes any sense. Insulation is typically the second massive cost you will face. If you have a loft that is not properly insulated, that might cost anywhere from a few £100s to a couple of thousand, depending on how accessible it is. If your home has cavity walls, filling them might cost £1,000 to £2,000. But many older properties do not have cavity walls at all. They have solid walls, and insulating solid walls is dramatically more expensive. External wall insulation can cost £15,000 to £25,000 and completely changes how your house looks, which might not even be allowed if you live in a conservation area or have a period property. Internal wall insulation is cheaper, but it makes your rooms smaller and requires major disruption as your walls are effectively rebuilt from the inside. Windows are another common requirement. If you have single glazing or even older double glazing that is not performing well anymore, you will score poorly on the assessment. Replacing all the windows in a typical 3-bedroom house costs anywhere from £5,000 to £15,000, and again, if your property is in a conservation area or listed, you face extra restrictions and even higher costs for heritage-appropriate replacements. When you add all this up, achieving that C rating on an older property can easily require £20,000 to £40,000 of investment, and for a pensioner living on a fixed income that might as well be £1 million because the money simply is not there. But even if you do not rent out your property and you just live in it yourself, you still need to pay very close attention to what I am telling you, because this affects your property value and your ability to sell when the time comes. The government has made it very clear that these energy efficiency standards will eventually apply to all homes, not just rentals. Mortgage lenders are already starting to factor EPC ratings into their decisions. Properties with poor energy ratings are becoming harder to mortgage, which means they are harder to sell at a fair price. Some lenders are already offering better interest rates for properties rated C or above, while charging higher rates for properties with lower ratings. The gap between what an energy-efficient home can sell for versus an inefficient home is growing every single year. When you eventually come to sell your property, whether that is next year or in 10 years' time, the buyers will absolutely factor in the cost of upgrades they will need to make to meet these standards. That cost comes directly off your sale price. So even if you never personally face a compliance deadline because you are not renting the property out, your home is losing value compared to properties that already meet the new standards. Every year you wait is another year your property falls further behind the market. Estate agents are already reporting cases where sales have fallen through because the EPC assessment came back worse than expected, and the cost of bringing the property up to standard made the deal unviable at the agreed price. Sellers who thought they knew what their house was worth are being told they need to drop the price by £20,000 or £30,000 to account for the work the buyer will need to do. Now I want to talk about enforcement because this is not one of those regulations that the government announces and then never actually follows through on. For rental properties, landlords who fail to meet the minimum EPC requirements will be legally prohibited from letting to new tenants, and eventually they will be prohibited from renewing existing tenancies even with tenants who are happy to stay. Local authorities have been given powers to issue fines of up to £30,000 per property for non-compliance, and unlike previous regulations that were largely ignored because enforcement was weak, the government has made it very clear they are serious this time. Trading standards departments are being given resources to pursue enforcement action, and tenant advocacy groups are being actively encouraged to report landlords who are not meeting the standards. There are exemptions available for properties where the improvements are not cost-effective or not technically feasible, but getting an exemption is not straightforward. You have to provide evidence from qualified assessors proving why the improvements cannot be done. The exemptions only last for 5 years, and then you have to reapply with updated evidence. And critically, having an exemption does not protect your property value. A property with an exemption might be legal to rent out, but buyers will still factor in the poor energy efficiency when making offers. The property remains harder to sell and harder to mortgage regardless of the exemption. So what should you actually do about all this? First, if you have not had an EPC assessment done recently, get one done now even if you already have one from a few years ago. You need to know where you stand under the current methodology, not the old one. The assessment costs around £60 to £100, and it will tell you exactly what your rating is and what improvements are needed to reach a C. Second, get quotes from multiple contractors for the work that is recommended. You need to know the real costs you are facing, not just estimates. Be aware that availability for this type of work is getting tight as more people realise they need it done, so booking early will likely get you better prices. Third, factor these costs into your financial planning. If you rely on rental income, calculate honestly whether the income can justify the investment you need to make. Many landlords, especially older ones living on pensions, are concluding that it no longer makes economic sense, and selling is the better option. If you are an owner-occupier, start putting money aside specifically for these improvements because they are not optional anymore. They are essential for preserving your property value. If you are thinking about buying a property, make absolutely sure your budget includes money for EPC improvements. Do not just trust the current rating. Get your own assessment done and factor upgrade costs into your offer price. And finally, engage with the political process. Write to your MP. Make noise about how these regulations are affecting pensioners on fixed incomes. These rules were brought in with minimal consultation, and the government needs to hear from ordinary people about the real-world impact. The more pressure property owners put on politicians now, the more likely we are to see realistic transition periods, proper financial support, and sensible exemptions for people who genuinely cannot afford compliance. The broader lesson here is that property ownership in the UK is becoming more complicated and more expensive, especially for older people who bought their homes decades ago and thought they were set for retirement. The assumption that you can buy a house, maintain it reasonably well, and enjoy stable ownership for the rest of your life is being challenged by regulations that impose new costs on owners. Energy efficiency is just one area. There are also building safety requirements, fire safety standards, electrical regulations, and accessibility standards, all adding costs that previous generations never had to budget for. Those of us in retirement need to stay informed because these quiet rule changes keep coming and the costs keep piling up. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this information helpful, please do hit that subscribe button so you do not miss future updates about property regulations that affect people like us. Make sure you understand where your property stands on the EPC ratings and start planning now for the costs you might face, because waiting until the deadline is forced upon you will only make everything more expensive and more stressful. The rule change has already happened. What you do next determines whether you are prepared or whether you get caught out. Stay informed, stay ahead, and I will see you in the next video.